Something is wrong. You can feel it before you understand it. Your heart rate climbs, your jaw tightens, your hands curl into fists at your sides. Someone in your group has crossed the line, and every cell in your body is already preparing. For 99% of human history, this moment was not the beginning of a fight. It was the end of a negotiation, a long, careful, invisible social negotiation that your ancestors had been running for hundreds of thousands of years. Because in their world, violence was not just dangerous, it was potentially lethal to the entire group. So, what did a fight actually look like 100,000 years ago? The answer is probably not what you're picturing. Let's start with what the bones tell us. When archaeologists study skeletal remains from ancient hunter-gatherer populations, they find something that doesn't fit either of the two stories we usually tell about our ancestors. The first story is that prehistoric humans were in constant brutal warfare, clubs and skulls, red in tooth and claw. The second story is that they lived in peaceful harmony before civilization corrupted them. Both stories are wrong. The bones tell something far more complicated and far more interesting. Lawrence Keeley, an archaeologist at the University of Illinois Chicago, spent decades analyzing skeletal evidence from prehistoric sites across the world. His landmark work, War Before Civilization, found that interpersonal violence was present in early human populations, but it was not organized the way we imagine war. It was personal. It was small. A raid here, a confrontation there, a single killing, sometimes years apart. Nothing resembling the mass, systematic violence that agriculture and statehood would later produce. But that's just the bones. The social mechanics of ancient conflicts go much deeper. Think about what daily life actually required of your ancestors. A group of roughly 25 to 50 people. No police, no prison, no courts, no walls, no escape. If you pushed someone too far, you did not face a lawyer or a fine or a suspended sentence. You faced the collective judgment of every single person you depended on for food, for warmth, for fire, for help when a predator came in the dark. That reality changed everything. How conflict started, how it escalated, and how it ended. Christopher Boehm, an anthropologist at the University of Southern California, spent decades studying hunter-gatherer societies across 6 continents and identified a pattern he called reverse dominance hierarchies. The term is academic, but the idea is simple. In these societies, any individual who tried to dominate, bully, hoard resources, or accumulate power over others was systematically held in check by the rest of the group. Not just avoided, actively suppressed. Gossip, public ridicule, collective mockery, temporary shunning. Your ancestors had an entire social toolkit for constraining aggression inside its acceptable boundaries, and it worked with remarkable consistency across cultures separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. So what happened when someone crossed that line anyway? Let's reconstruct the moment. A camp somewhere on the East African savanna. Roughly 80,000 years ago. Low, scrubby trees, a small fire burning down to coals, the smell of cooked meat in the air. 2 men, a dispute. It's about who carried the carcass back and who gets the larger share. It seems small. To them, it isn't. Calories were life. Every share mattered. It starts with words. Short, clipped, tense. The rest of the camp goes quiet almost immediately. Not out of curiosity. Out of something deeper, a social attentiveness that was itself a survival mechanism. Every person within earshot is now reading signals, body posture, eye contact, vocal pitch, breathing. Because what happens next carries information that affects every single person in that group. This is a stage most people skip when they imagine ancient conflict. There is a middle phase, a display phase. Chest forward, voice raised, eyes locked, arms wide. It looks like aggression, and it is aggression, but it is also communication. It is saying, I am capable, I am not backing down. It is an advertisement of willingness, not necessarily of intent. Your ancestors were exquisitely good at reading this display. because reading it correctly was a survival skill. Knowing when a confrontation was pure performance and when it was tipping into something real and irreversible was the difference between walking away with your dignity and not walking away at all. Richard Wrangham, a biological anthropologist at Harvard University who has spent his career studying the deep evolutionary roots of human aggression, found something striking when comparing human violence to the violence of our closest primate relatives. What distinguishes humans is not that we fight more, it's that we plan violence more deliberately. A chimpanzee confrontation is impulsive, reactive, noisy. Human violence, even 100,000 years ago, had a logic. A cold, risk-calculated logic that was deployed only when the odds were near certain and the cost was low. That finding changes everything, because the most common form of lethal violence in prehistoric human populations was not the face-to-face duel. It was not two men squaring off while their group watched. According to the evidence across multiple archaeological sites, the most common form of ancient lethal violence was the ambush, the surprise attack, the deliberate overwhelming of a target who never had a chance to respond. One of the clearest windows into this reality came from a site called Nataruk in Kenya. A team led by Marta Mirazan-Lar at Cambridge University excavated and analyzed the site, publishing their findings in 2016. Near the edge of an ancient lagoon, the remains of at least 27 individuals were found. Men, women, children, including a woman in the late stages of pregnancy. They had been killed roughly 10,000 years ago. The skeletal evidence showed blunt force trauma to the skull, projectile points embedded in bone, and signs that some individuals had their hands bound before death. These were not warriors who fell in open battle. These were people who were caught, surprised, overwhelmed before they could react. Nataruk was not a war, it was a massacre. A calculated, targeted strike executed with overwhelming force against a group that never saw it coming. What Nataruk tells us is that when ancient humans made the decision to use lethal violence, they made it coldly, not because they were savage, because they were strategic. Now, back to your camp, to the two men, to the moment the rest of the group holds its breath. If the confrontation reads as display, as performative aggression that both men are still willing to step back from, someone will intervene. Usually an elder, usually someone whose social weight in the group is recognized without being spoken. The intervention is rarely loud, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet word that redirects, a joke that cuts the tension sideways, a gentle movement that places a body between the two men without making that placement feel like a challenge. Douglas Fry, an anthropologist at the University of Helsinki who has documented conflict resolution across dozens of forager societies around the world, found that this kind of quiet, lateral diffusion is the dominant pattern in hunter-gatherer communities. Conflict in these groups is not typically resolved through dominance, through one person simply overpowering the other. It's resolved through social engineering, through the collective wisdom of people who cannot afford to lose any single member of their group to injury, exile, or grief. So the fight, most of the time, doesn't happen. But sometimes it does. And sometimes a person becomes chronically dangerous. A man who hits repeatedly, who threatens too freely, who takes more than his share across weeks and months and ignores every social correction the group deploys. Bohm documented, across multiple cultures and continents, what happened in these cases. The group did not wait for the problem to resolve itself. They convened quietly, away from the individual, and they discussed, sometimes for days. And then they acted. What Bohm called moralistic killing was not rage. It was a group decision, a deliberate removal of a chronic threat. Every member of the group bore collective responsibility for it. It was, in a deeply unsentimental sense, an ancient and unsentimental form of justice, with no court, no judge, no record, and no appeal. Here is the twist that reframes everything you just heard. Ancient humans were not more violent than us. In many critical ways, they were more disciplined about violence than we are. They constrained it through social architecture that made daily aggression immediately visible and costly. They diffused it through collective pressure before it reached the no return. And when they did use lethal force, it was either the sudden chaos of an ambush or the cold deliberation of a unanimous group decision. What they did not have is what we have today: the ability to harm people at distance, in systems, invisibly, without social consequence. They had no trolling, no institutional cruelty carried out by bureaucracies no one person is responsible for, no weapon that killed from a kilometer away without ever having to look into someone's eyes. Their violence was close, personal, witnessed by everyone they knew, and that unavoidable proximity, that inescapable social witness, was one of the most powerful brakes on human violence that has ever existed. Not because ancient humans were kinder, because the cost of cruelty was immediate and undeniable. Now, think about that jaw clench again, that tightening in your chest, that electricity behind your eyes when someone crosses a line. That response is not new. It is hundreds of thousands of years old. But so is the other thing: the instinct to scan the room before you act, to weigh what this moment will cost you, to sense the watching eyes of the group around you and ask, without words, whether this is the moment or whether there is another way through. You learned that restraint somewhere, but it didn't start with you. It was shaped into you by 100,000 generations of people who understood, at the level of survival itself, that they needed every single person in their group to still be alive tomorrow. Something is wrong. You can feel it before you understand it. Your ancestors felt it too. And most of the time, with that ancient, bone-deep calculation, they put it down.